Hi, how are you? Yeah, thank you. I wrote the thank you in before just to be transparent because I was expecting applause, so it would have been awkward if you didn't applaud, but I'm glad it worked out. Yeah, so GraphQL without GraphQL. GraphQL-inspired queries for co-locating data requests with components. That's a lot of words, and I basically don't know what any of them mean. And so hopefully you guys do, and you can tell me later. But essentially, this talk will focus on the power of not just full GraphQL buy-in, but each part of the GraphQL ecosystem and how you can use one part without necessarily needing to use every part. Not every project is going to need to spend the time to make the back end. Not every project has control of the back end, and you might still want to use like the expressiveness of GraphQL queries without actually having to have full GraphQL. So briefly, I'll just go over what I'll cover. What are the design principles of GraphQL? I'm sure a lot of us have used GraphQL, but have not read the spec, which is expectable. But I spent a lot of time reading the spec recently, and there's like apparently 5 design principles that drive the development of GraphQL. What's inherently appealing about GraphQL? Why do people want to use it? Why do we care about using GraphQL as opposed to what we've used in the past? Can I just use parts of GraphQL? Is it even possible? And specifically, can I just use a query system in my UI and talk to any backend? So as Tom said, I'm Conor Hastings. I noticed I watched some other talks preparing for this, and they do like the agenda first and then introduce themselves. I thought that was really cool, so that's why I did this. I'm a UI engineer at Netflix. I'm on Twitter at StillConor, GitHub Conor Hastings, and right here in the physical world, if the physical world exists. So yeah, enough about me. So GraphQL design principles, they exist, they're out there. There's 5 of them. The first one is hierarchical. Essentially, you have this query. It is structured in the nature of the shape of your data. You can look at it, and then you will receive the data back in the same way that you asked for it, which is super nice. Product-centric, which if you think about traditionally about APIs and product-centric, they don't necessarily fit together. A lot of times, it feels like the APIs you're working with are actually in direct defiance of the UI application that is using it. And it just ends up overcomplicating front-end logic, overcomplicating the view layer, and having too much logic there, and leads to bugs. Strong typing. This is, to me, I guess, at the back end, the main point of the backend implementation of GraphQL, where it kind of is like it eases you into types nicely. So it's kind of like .string. It's like, OK, I could deal with that. It's chill. It's not too much. But it also allows you to do like a lot of really cool things, like compile time test generation, where you can make sure every query that your front end is making is actually compatible with your backend schema. So it empowers a lot of things. Client-specified queries, kind of very similar to product-centric and hierarchical, so you can kind of see where they're going. They really actually care about products and not just like these silos of APIs and products. So yeah, super dope. The comparison I like to make there is you're kind of requesting exactly what you want. So imagine a traditional API to me is you order a pizza, and it comes with every single topping that a pizza could possibly come with. And you're like, you pick everyone off until you have the 4 that you want. Where in GraphQL, you just say, yeah, I just want these 4 toppings. Please don't send me 40 toppings. Introspective, I won't spend long on this one because I don't really know what it means that much. But essentially, from what I can gather, is that a GraphQL schema is in itself queryable as like a GraphQL entity. So you can say like you have a type user, and you could do a query against user asking for its fields and the types of its fields, which is cool, but yeah, I don't really understand it. So what's appealing about GraphQL? A lot of things. I'll run through some of them quickly. The query system is extremely powerful. As I've mentioned 3 times, I think, so far. You kind of have this hierarchical structure, and you get the data the way you want it. It's really nice because it will fill in with nulls and not undefined if the data doesn't come back, so you don't end up with weird JSON stringify things. And also, there's this idea of like query or schema directives, where you can have like custom logic built in, like skipping conditionally, fetching data, including data conditionally. Apollo has the idea of like deferring certain selection sets. So more important data will come first and be requested first. And so you can kind of get a quick render with important data, then have the other data patched in. And that's kind of all just built into the spec, which is super nice. Less data over the wire, especially as we move more towards like mobile phones. And the next one is similar, reducing round trips. High latency, lower speed devices. The less data you're sending over the wire, the better. It's going to take you longer to get that 40 topping pizza. Developer tooling, because of this is kind of how I understand introspectiveness. It makes it easy to build developer tooling because you can kind of talk to the schema about the schema, which allows like hinting and tools like GraphQL, if you've used before, which are really cool. And there's probably a lot of other things that I just don't know, so please tell me if you do know them. And then comes the point where you talk to your manager, and you're like, I really want GraphQL. And he says, but why? Why do we need GraphQL? You just explained to me 5 problems, and we only need to solve 1 of these. Why are we going to solve 5 of them? So what if you don't need to solve all the problems? There's not a strong business case for less data over the wire. So personally, I work mainly on internal applications. Every employee at Netflix is on very high-speed internet. So our requests are going to be very quickly. We can kind of get away with large payloads. And there's like 200 users, maybe. So we're not dealing with high user counts. We're not dealing with large payloads. So this is not a great cornerstone argument for me if I want to implement GraphQL. My application is short-lived, and it's not worth devoting the resources and time. That's me in moving the clock. That's me just wasting time working on GraphQL when we don't need it. Or if you're just like doing a hack project, like you might not need to implement an entire type system, but you still kind of want a nice front-end workflow. My application's new, data types are changing a lot, you're kind of in an experimentation phase, and you're constantly changing that schema. That can get super annoying. You don't control the backend data source. I think like the talk earlier I mentioned Firebase. If you want to talk directly to Firebase from your front end, that's not going to come back as GraphQL, but you still might want to use a GraphQL-style query to get that data. So it's all about the query system, as I will continue to say, I think 30 more times. Again, that's me. Falling off a couch, that actually did hurt quite a bit. But it's just meant to illustrate that we've all felt this way working with APIs or a new application where we go into a component and we see the componented mount and it says, get settings. And you have to like implement something with a new setting, and you're like, get settings. OK, what is that? And then you just dig around the application, eventually find the 40 settings that come back, and you find row width, and you use it, but you're like a little demoralized on your first day of work because it took you way too long to change the row width. So this is a term I think a lot of people remember if you were around in the Web 1.0 days, or use Squarespace, I think, which kind of does this now. WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, but I think it's super duper applicable to GraphQL. You look at a data structure that you have written, and that data structure that you see is the same data structure essentially that you get back. So you are not worrying about like the shape from the API. It's just removing a worry from your mind. And I remember using Dreamweaver when I was like 13, and I thought it was dope. So yeah, declarative data fetching, which I think another talk again talked on like declarativeness versus imperativeness. The imperative layer probably lives somewhere, but if it's not living in your application, that's a lot nicer. If you just look at a component and you see user, name, whatever, created date, settings, row width, column width, same. That's much nicer than seeing get settings, get user. You know exactly what you're getting, and you don't really care about the implementation of how it's fetching the data, because that doesn't matter to actually building an application. So, for example, and I am not picking on Redux, I use Redux heavily, but you might, and this is probably bad Redux code as well, but you might see something like this. Just get user, get settings. And you're like, what? OK, cool. But GraphQL, you might see something like this, where you explicitly saying, I want the user's ID, name, created date, settings, column width, theme. You're implementing a feature because we forgot row width, and you just add row width, and you're done, and you're happy. You're a happy new employee that will stay. Oh, I forgot to show it. Did I? Yeah. That was weird, because I could see it. My bad. Yeah, so I think of this query system a lot like I think of myself, a beautiful gift to the world. I'm going to come out of that bag eventually. Yeah, so can we just use the query system? When I was practicing this talk, I thought a lot about how funny it would be if I just ended the talk here by saying, no, we actually can't. You need to do full GraphQL buy-in. But that would be super messed up. So I'm not going to do that. So the answer is kind of. So the GraphQL JS team has done an absolutely fantastic job modularizing the packages from within GraphQL JS, so you can use just the parser, for example, without having to use everything. So if we go back through the design principles, you'll see hierarchical, yeah, still got it. Product-centric, for sure. Strong typing, kind of bi, because we don't have a schema. So we can't type something without a schema. Client-specified queries, yes. Introspective, no, but none of us really know what it means, so it's cool. Yeah, and then the appeal. Query system, still got it. The shape of the data, less data over the wire. No, we're still going to get the 40 toppings, but the guy at the pizza store is going to pick them off for us. And reducing round trips to the server, yeah, we're not really going to get that either, but by basically moving it out of the application layer, the module layer can do a lot more optimizations around the fetching. So we still do gain some benefits there. So I'll put like an asterisk. And developer tooling, kind of. We basically lose it, like you don't get GraphQL anymore, but because of the query-driven nature of the GraphQL queries and the ability to parse EST, we could build new developer tooling around it, but then we'd be wasting time again. So how? I'm only going to talk about one specific thing because it's something I made, and I know the most about the things that I made. So RouteQL is what I call it for now. Name pending, patent not. Essentially, it's based on using these tools from GraphQL JS and the paradigms that have been made popular by Apollo, which is a tool I've used extensively, and kind of just building a system that can agnostically query any backend. RPC, REST, Firebase, what have you. So you sacrifice some of those niceties of GraphQL, the typing, graphical, but you still get the expressiveness of the query, which for me is the thing that was like really made GraphQL click and made me want to use it. So because we have access to the parser, if it's not a valid GraphQL query, it won't be a valid RouteQL query. It will fail in the parser stage. So you can imagine the benefits there as being if you do move towards full GraphQL buy-in, migration is not that difficult because you have already written GraphQL queries. You just don't have a GraphQL backend. Yeah, so this has been a little boring. I've been talking a lot, so we can look at some code. So here's an example of a very simple Apollo query. Yeah, where we are just getting the title of a post and showing it. And then here's what it would look like in RouteQL. It's very similar. You might notice a few key differences. One is we're not actually passing any arguments into the query. So you might be saying, how does it know what post to get? The Apollo query was asking for post ID 1. This asks for nothing. So we have this extra thing currently, essentially request data for fields, which will get props, fields, and like subselections. And you generate essentially an object that returns params, query params, optionally a body for mutations, and that will actually generate the request that is made to the server. How does this work? Let's all find out together. Yeah. So essentially, you pass in the query. So right now, you can pass in as a string or actually the AST. So if it's a string, I will parse it for you. If not, I will just use what you've passed in. Probably going to get away from the passing in the string just because when you pass in the AST directly, which is kind of like the standard among other GraphQL libraries, you can do a lot more application-side optimization. But maybe I'll leave it. So yeah, so this is like really the core of how it works, is you take the selections the person's made, like in the earlier example, user and settings, and you just map over the selection set after you parse the AST. And if you've never used astexplorer.net, I give a full shout out to that website because I would have never understood how to do anything remotely like this without it. Yeah, so and then request data for field, it will call it. You'll return a method, params, query params. Method will default to get for a query, post for a mutation, but you can change it to a put if it's a put request, or a patch if it's a patch request. And then essentially forms a string, the param string, query string from that. You can pass in your own fetch implementation or the native browser one. By default, it will use a library called fetch-dedupe, which was made by my colleague James Smith, who is way smarter than me. It basically implements a lot of the stuff that Apollo implements around caching and uses actually the same named arguments as Apollo, like so cache first, network first, cache only, which again makes migration easier. So I've focused, especially more recently, on making it migratable. Like I see this not necessarily as a forever solution for an application, but kind of like I want to spin something up and we don't even know if it's going to exist. Why am I going to do all this extra work? So a lot of the stuff is moving in line with essentially Apollo. And then here you'll see another key difference, perhaps, is that the resolver exists on the front end, which you would either pass into like a top-level resolver or a resolver per query, whatever you want. The resolver per query will win if you've passed it in both, but you don't have to. Then it just takes that data, it's an array, it will map it, and it will pick out the things you've selected. If it's just an object, it will just pick out the things you've selected. Yep. So here is some stuff that's actually using it, so you know it's not fake, even though theoretically it could still be fake, because I could have just written that code and then actually used GraphQL to power the GIF, but I didn't. So you see it's making this query. It's using the request data for field. It's using the resolver because, let's say, our backend API returns it as person name, but we actually want to call it name. And then it's using a poll interval of 1,000 milliseconds, which essentially means it's going to refetch the data every 1 second. And that's why you see the checkboxes changing a lot. And then you can do the same exact thing, except using render props and then hooks soon. You will be able to do it with hooks, because that is what everyone's doing now. And then, yeah, here just same thing, but a mutation, incrementing a count. Again, this is higher order component. And then same thing, but using render props, where the argument to the render prop is the thing that will fire the mutation and actually make the call to your backend. So you might be asking yourself, has this ever actually been used in a real-world app? Or is this just that one page that he made once? I put real in quotes for a reason. It means no. For short. But kind of yes. I don't know how many of you know what this movie is from. Yep. I heard Clueless out there. One of my favorite movies of all time. I was super jealous of Cher's closet in the movie. Long desired it. How she could just pick out her outfits. Yeah, still want it. So I decided to make the 2018 version using, so I could just actually test my library and make sure it actually existed. Not quite as good as her. Surprisingly, she had a very advanced machine learning in 1995, because it would tell her if her clothes didn't match, and I couldn't figure out how to do that. So Cher had a very good development team. Yeah, so I'd like to also mention some other things that are like this in the world. It's not a completely original idea from the depths of my mind. So there's GraphQL Anywhere, which is a project that essentially allows you to execute any GraphQL query. Differences being you would do all the fetch side logic yourself and then pass that into GraphQL Anywhere with the query. This is made by the Apollo team. Very interesting project, though. I encourage reading the documentation there. They have some interesting ideas around using GraphQL for non-fetch-based stuff, styling with GraphQL queries. So I think the expressiveness of the query language lends itself to more than fetching, and we're still very new to the ecosystem, and a lot of cool stuff will be coming out of it. Apollo Link REST, which is more in line with the project I've talked about today. This is essentially literally plugs into Apollo and uses schema directives to hit REST endpoints. Differences being it's a bit more prescriptive in how you use it. But I would fully recommend this if you are transitioning an API from REST to GraphQL, because it will essentially allow you to use that directive to make certain queries as REST queries and certain things as actual GraphQL queries. So it's really great for an incremental migration. And yeah, also probably other things, please tell me, as it is for most things with me. I know almost none of it. Yeah, so quick recap. Hopefully we've learned some things and I haven't just wasted your time. What's supported right now? Querying and mutating arbitrary backends with render prop components or higher order components. Polling for data with poll interval. No subscriptions, because that's over my head, I think, for now. Caching of query data. So if you are making a query in 2 components, it's not going to make that request twice. If by default, it will use cache first, so it will hit the cache. You can use cache only, so you can actually do offline stuff as well. Probably some other stuff I'm forgetting because I wrote it at differing times over the last few months. And then what's coming, this is more exciting for me. This is actually a problem I ran into recently while trying to use my own library, is right now you can only make requests on top-level selection sets. And in GraphQL, you can have sub-selection set resolvers. So allowing that is top of mind for me. Instead of using request data for field, which is kind of an awkward prop, moving towards arguments, which would then also give you the added benefits of you kind of get types, because you'd have typing in your query. So you'd have at least typing at the query level, if not a schema level. And then this is something I've been working on, and I'm really excited about, and I think will make this much more useful, is automated migration to Apollo. So you've used this, you've decided you have this long-lasting project, and you're like, now I really want to use GraphQL, but I'm stuck with this weird middle solution. So just like command line, blah, 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 make Apollo, and then all of a sudden you have an Apollo app instead of an app that is like half of it. And then deferred queries, I think the Apollo team's proposals there are really interesting, and implementing that, I think, is important for me, because I think especially if you have just pages where some data is more important or some data is not displaying on the initial render, being able to say, I want this data to be marked as less important, I want you to get the other stuff first, will be really cool. And then optimistic updates and direct access to the cache, also coming soon. I have a PR in, James Smith, if you're listening. Yeah. And then finally, so just to recap everything I've said, GraphQL has introduced these very powerful paradigms for front ends to talk to back ends, but we've been kind of limited in scope in that you have to go full GraphQL or no GraphQL. And the idea of a middle ground was very interesting to me. Very wide appeal for UI developers, I think, where frequently, at least in the past, we've kind of been the second fiddle to the back-end developers. This kind of changes the power structure, or hopefully you just have a really good working relationship with your back-end developers. I do. So not calling out every back-end developer in the world, but a lot of times APIs are not made for a product. They're made to be used by many things. So even with the best intentions, you might not be getting what you want. And yeah, by making some sacrifices and giving up some of the benefits of GraphQL, we can still leverage the power of the query system. We can still co-locate data. We can abstract out the actual request stuff and make cool apps quicker. So that's it. Once again, I'm on Twitter, still Conor, GitHub Conor Hastings, and you can find me at this conference in the physical world. And Conor Hastings RouteQL on GitHub. Thank you.